What was that moment when you realized that now it's the time to talk about healing? Now it's the time to talk about traumas.
We've all heard of trauma, but the reality is that all life has trauma in it.
In a world of extraordinary, unbearable, almost unimaginable suffering.
And so there is no one better to talk about the idea of conscious capitalism than the founder of this movement and also the author of the book Conscious Capitalism, which I think many of you have by now. So I'd love to welcome to the stage Raj Sisodia.
There's a lot of silent suffering in the world of business. Heart attacks are 20% higher on Mondays. Global engagement levels are around 20%. Does it have to be that to run a successful business, we have to burn people out and we have to shorten their lives? And to me, it's unacceptable that these become the side effects of business. And so I set out to explore the idea. And the key issue with trauma is it ends up affecting how you respond to things in the future. We're kind of conditioned to be stoic, right? To keep our problems to ourselves, to not whine.
What I'm listening right now is that we live in a choiceless world and we believe we have got choices.
But we are not choiceless. You can trace it. So there's personal trauma I experienced directly as a child, something that happened 75 years ago, which was an honor killing basically in our family, where one of my aunts got pregnant and was raped by a priest.
When you said she was killed, by whom?
Within the family. Yeah, her own brother. Almost every human can trace back. They were either enslaved or they were the enslavers in some way, or they were the abusers or the victims, and both are traumatic. The more trauma there is in the background, the more there will be these escape mechanisms that people will use.
Yeah.
Because we have now the ability to stop this cycle.
Raj, thank you so much. Such a pleasure having you here.
My pleasure, Gaurav. I've been looking forward to this conversation with you.
Oh, I've been looking forward to have you on my podcast for several years. And every time when I request you, you would tell me that there's a new book coming and let's have that conversation when that gets out. And finally, we are here. So when we are going to explore your new book called Awaken.
Great, let's do it.
Raj, help me understand. You've been known for the movement that you started, which is around conscious capitalism. You are the co-founder, the co-chairman of this movement, the global movement called the Conscious Capitalism, where you spoke about elevating humanity through businesses. And the last two books that you have written, one was Healing Organization, and the latest one is Awaken, A Journey to Purpose, Wholeness, Healing, and Impact. I'm just wondering, from conscious capitalism to talking about healing, talking about trauma, what was that moment when you realized that now it's the time to talk about healing? Now it's the time to talk about traumas.
Yeah, so if we look at our critique of capitalism and why we created conscious capitalism is because we felt it was at a lower level of consciousness and thinking about business too narrowly, thinking about business only in terms of profit, for example, only in terms of the owner's interests, thinking of leadership very narrowly, just in terms of delivering bottom line, and a culture that's only about how much can we get out of people, right? And so we thought all of that was a narrow and a sort of an instrumental way of thinking about business, right? We use people for us. So there's a deeper consciousness with which you can do it, and therefore we have the principles, the why, the what, the who, and the how of business needs different answers at that higher level of consciousness. So the why goes from profit to purpose. You still need profit, you always include and transcend, but there should be a purpose, just like for every human life, there should be a purpose. The what was about creating value of multiple kinds for everybody whose life is touched by the business, not just for the owners or customers. And then the who is, who are we as leaders? It's not just about doing, but it's about being as well. And how do we define success? What does it mean to be a leader? It's not just about achieving power and wealth through your leadership. Actually is the definition of a tyrant, somebody who uses other people to achieve their own ego-based goals. So leadership is really about taking people to a better place. right? And it's really about making life better. And that's really the deepest source of satisfaction for human
mm,
beings,
mm,
having a
mm,
positive impact on others. And then the how is, how does it feel to work in this organization? And most traditional businesses have a great amount of stress and burnout. Heart attacks are 20% higher on Mondays. Global engagement levels are around 20%.
mm,
Right? There's just a lot of, and then that's where it really started to speak to me that there's a lot of suffering.
mm,
There's a lot of silent suffering in the world of business.
mm,
You
mm,
know, people are burned out, their lives are getting shortened. 120,000 Americans die from too much stress at work, 600,000 Chinese die from too much work.
mm.
And data like that, I'm sure, exists in India and everywhere else.
Yeah.
The human cost of doing business started to really, impact me as I thought about it. I said, this is the
Mm,
biggest cost we have, right? And there's lots of data on that cost. We're not doing anything about it. It doesn't show up on an income statement or a balance sheet. But
mm,
then I started to think about the flip side of that. Does it have
mm,
to be that? Right? Does it have to be that to run a successful business, we have to burn people out and we have to
mm,
shorten their lives and we have to do all of these, the damage to the environment and to society and all of that? We've somehow made those into acceptable side effects of business. And I said, that's not okay. So I started
yeah.
to think about, there is a lot of suffering in the world. We have through capitalism alleviated certain aspects of it in the last 200 years. Per capita incomes have gone up, life expectancy has gone up, literacy and some other important things have improved, but there's still a lot of suffering
Mm,
and a lot of silent suffering. There's also psychological suffering, anxiety, stress, burnout, depression, drug addiction, and even suicides. All of these things have increased. And to me, it's unacceptable that these become the side effects of business. And so I set out to explore the idea that it's not about healing businesses. It's not about saying we need businesses that are
mm,
about nurturing the spirit or, yoga and massage and human development,
mm,
retreat centers. But this is about business itself as a healing activity,
mm, mm,
business as
mm.
a healing act. And that
Being,
requires us to
you said business as healing activity.
business itself as a healing activity. Why?
Yeah.
Because think about it, in a free society, governments are not supposed to take care of us, right?
Mm,
Businesses are given the opportunity, but
mm,
also the responsibility of helping us meet our needs, right? Now, if I do that in a thoughtful, caring, and loving way, then I heal you in that dimension. If you have a need and I meet your need in a really respectful,
yeah.
caring way, I heal you. But if I use you to just make money for myself, in a way take advantage of your vulnerability,
Mm,
that here's somebody who really needs something and therefore let me squeeze them, then that same business becomes a source of suffering,
mm.
right? So business can be done as a way that reduces suffering and brings more joy.
Yeah.
And that's how I
Yeah.
did healing.
Very interesting, Raj. You work with the few of the top C-suite executives in the world. I'm just wondering, do these people understand your language? Do they understand what it means to have business as a healing activity? Do they understand terms like healing, suffering, traumas, impact?
Yeah. There's a little resistance in the beginning to the idea that, oh, we're not causing suffering. We're providing
Yeah.
jobs and we're
Yeah.
providing goods and services and we're, paying taxes and creating. But then, as I said, if you don't acknowledge the full impact of
Mm,
what is happening, you're actually not seeing reality. I use
mm,
that quote by James Baldwin. Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. So we have to
mm.
actually look at the reality of what's happening, right? Because of the way in which we do business. And
Yeah.
once I'm able to show them that, what is life like for people
Mm,
in your organization, not just the people, the executives and the managers and so forth that you typically as a leader
mm,
interact with, but the people at the front lines of your organization, right? People at the entry levels.
mm,
What is their like? One of my favorite quotes now is from Senator Raphael Warnock, who's also the pastor at the Martin Luther King Church in Atlanta, the Epicenter Baptist Church. And he said, in order to lead the people, you must love the people.
mm,
And to love the people, you must know the people.
mm,
And to know the people, you must walk among the people. So I challenge leaders, do you really know what life is like in your own
mm,
organization for the people
mm.
who are and they're working perhaps the hardest of anybody in this organization, and their lives are filled with so much stress and so much uncertainty, and they are this far away from ruin because they have no buffer between them and a financial disaster. Something happens in their life falls apart,
Yeah.
and they're dealing with this daily stress in their lives. The more I work in this area, more I'm descending from the head into the heart and the soul,
Yeah.
right, of the leader.
No, I think that one question itself is very powerful. Do you know the life of the people working in your organization? Raj, in your book, you have emphasized on terms like healing traumas and uniting polarities in our lives. Now, if you were to define the term trauma, how would you define that? And when you use the word uniting polarities, what does that mean?
Yes. So, trauma is something that I have really started to examine in the last few years.
Hmm.
We've all heard of trauma, but we hear of it in the context of PTSD, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder. And we associate it with people who have been sent to wars like Afghanistan, Iraq, or people who were at the front lines when 9/11 happened and they had to rush into those buildings, firefighters, police, in some cases, armies. So we think about it in the extreme example of it. And therefore, we think that, all of our lives, which we don't have to face those kinds of situations, that we are devoid of trauma. But the reality is that all life has trauma in it.
All.
Living, yes, every human life, there's trauma in it. Right? There's predictable trauma that happens in every child's life. Most children go through certain kinds of trauma. For example, we talk about the first time a child is rejected by his or her friends. Right? That's a little trauma there. That's basically said, I don't belong. Right? For the first time a child experiences the disappointment of a parent, then the message is, I'm not enough. Right?
So this cannot be avoided, right?
Well, not really. I don't think so. You can't. You can't sail through life, with shock absorbers and protecting you from everything. This is part of life, right? So there's something that happens, but there's a psychological imprint that remains. So there's an inciting incident, but there's a lasting psychological messaging that gets encoded, and that then drives you. I mean, the key problem, the issue with the trauma is it then ends up affecting how you respond to things in the future. It's a trauma response, basically.
Yeah.
Right? And so you are kind of locked into that. You're not in charge of your own actions. You become highly reactive.
Yeah.
Right? You don't even know who's driving your car. You're kind of a passenger in your own life.
So rather than saying that I have traumas, it's actually the traumas are having us.
Yes, until we do something about it. We have to, first of all, acknowledge, yes, I've had traumas. So in my case, that took me a while to get to that place because I didn't.
And when you're saying while means what?
A while has been like decades. I mean, this is only something that I've come face to face with in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Right? The traumas that I did experience, I did not label them as such. Now, what we say about trauma is that most people do not acknowledge them, even though most human beings are living in some state of post-traumatic stress injury. Maybe it's not a disorder, but there's definitely a trauma injury, right? Most of us don't acknowledge it. So what do? We conceal it. We don't talk about the hard things that happen, right? A difficult relationship, in my case, with my father and some traumatic incidents, or things that happen in our family history that are dark and shameful. And many of us have those as well. So we don't acknowledge them. We hide them, right? So we conceal it, but then it's there, right? Eating away at our peace of mind. So then we have to numb it. How do most people numb it? With drugs and alcohol is the most common, right? I mean, alcohol is a widely available legal substance anywhere in the world to help you forget, your pain. And I have to say, my father had his own severe trauma, and he could not function without his alcohol every day. In the evening, he would drink of the day, but that was the only time that I had some peace because he was struggling, with lack of peace of mind. And so what do? So we conceal it and then we numb it. But then, of course, that doesn't last, right? And so we get the short-term high, literally. But then, of course, it descends and then you're back to where you were and the trauma is still as present as ever. And what I'm advocating for in this book and what a lot of healers of trauma would talk about, the first step is to reveal it to yourself and ideally to others.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Talk about it. right? Bring it into the open. So reveal it and then feel it. Allow yourself to feel that trauma, because often we have locked it away somewhere in our psyche. We don't want to go there, right? We don't want to face up to this. Too painful, the emotion that trauma brings up, or the memory that it brings up. When I was writing this book, I mean, I experienced so many aches and pains in my body during the process of because I was uncovering some very painful memories along the way and reliving those traumas. But that's essential. So, right, so you reveal it and feel it and you grieve it so that you can heal it ultimately, right? So those feelings have to be processed, right? And there are now additional modalities available for us to heal from these traumas. There's a long list of things that are now available, including compassionate inquiry from Gabor Mate. There's EMDR, which has to do with eye movement. There's all kinds of other therapies. There's also a lot of now research showing that some of the psychedelics, like MDMA and psilocybin mushrooms, can have almost miraculous effects on people with severe trauma, that it can finally reconnect you back to who you are, because you kind of lose yourself, right? Once you have these traumas, you become kind of disassociated from your own being. And a lot of these are showing dramatic results, actually. So there's a lot of hope. The great news about the time we are living in right now is there's great awareness about trauma and recognizing it as a nearly universal human condition. But in the past, we really didn't have good ways to deal with it. We had some therapies and we had some very, very potent drugs with really numbing effects and also very bad side effects. Right? The hope of a cure. But now these modalities are offering the hope. And then the beautiful thing about that is if you do go through this painful work, it is hard, that you can experience what's called a post-traumatic growth. So you are now stronger because you had that trauma and you acknowledged it and you worked on it and you healed from it. You are stronger than if you never had the trauma in the first place. You were asking earlier, some people go through life, a charmed life perhaps, but I would say it's not a charmed life. It's cursed in its own way, because unless you experience these things in life, you don't grow those muscles and capacities, right? So now that person who has had that and worked on it and healed is stronger than the person who never had that, and they can become a source of healing for others. So this is the idea of the wounded healer.
Right? I love the concept when you spoke about that. In order to heal it, we have to first reveal it, and then we have to feel it, and then grieve it, and then we can heal it. But before that, you spoke about something which is very important, and that's what I've actually experienced in my life. For the longest period of time, I've been operating from a space that trauma is not for everyone. So the point that I'm picking up right now is that we all go through traumas in our lives, right? We cannot avoid it, because if a small act of being left out can cause some or the other kind of trauma, so that means we all go through traumas in our life. You mentioned that people don't even acknowledge that. Two questions. Why wouldn't someone acknowledge that she is or he's dealing with something which could be traumatic? That's one. Second, what could be those early signs that one can pick up?
Yeah, sure. I think the first one is that we're kind of conditioned to be stoic, right? To keep our problems to ourselves, to not whine, to recognize, doesn't matter what problem you have. There are many people who have worse situations in their life. You just have to look out the window, in most places in the world and see all kinds of people struggling with life. And so we have tended to therefore minimize it, because we feel in a way shame that why am I complaining about this? Because it could be so much worse, right? Now, what I say is that just because something is common doesn't make it less impactful. Just because everybody experiences something doesn't mean that that experience is not a powerful one, right? So we have to first get past that hurdle, recognize that, yes, life is hard and things happen, some predictable and many unusual things that happen to each of us in this journey, right? And that unless we heal, or unless we acknowledge that, there's no healing. And unless we heal that, we're not in control of our own lives or our own reactions. And that goes to the second part of your question, is that when you start to not even understand your own reactions to things, when you start to have what others would consider a disproportionate response to something. When somebody uses a particular word with you and you suddenly have a big reaction to it, right? It's touching something in your psyche that might
And
be
you're not
buried.
even aware of that.
You may not be aware of it, but the what we call the amygdala hijack,
Yeah.
right, is a hint that there's something that happened early in your life. Like my son, when he was 2 years old, we were at a picnic and there was a dog and he was sitting behind the dog and just rubbing its back or petting the dog, right? And suddenly the dog turned around and barked loudly and snapped at him, right? And that has imprinted in him a deep fear. He's 34 years old now, but now he has no conscious memory of what happened when he was 2, right? But anytime we're walking in a park and there's a dog literally on the other side of the park, he will start running the other direction. He has such a deep fear. And so that is the kind of thing that tells you that there is a trauma buried there, right? Anytime we have fears of different kinds, like if you have fear of heights, or if you have fear of claustrophobia, etc., probably there's a trauma either in your, this is the where it gets really fascinating. It could have happened in your own life at a pre-conscious stage where you don't remember, or it could have happened in your ancestors. Now, this is the fascinating thing, epigenetics, relatively new field.
Wow.
And what epigenetics is finding is that things that happened 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 generations ago, traumatic things, they actually impact your gene expression, right? So those genes get passed on through the generations, and then they get expressed in a certain way because of what was imprinted early on, right?
5 generations back.
Could be as much as 5 generations back. So, for example, they talk about in the US, the African American population here, most of whom can trace their ancestry back to slavery, that there's a disproportionate fear of dogs among African Americans on average, right? They say, why would that be? Even if they don't have any negative experience in their own life, why? Because dogs were used by slave owners to control the slaves, to capture them if they tried to run away, and very vicious dogs. And so that is very, now if you think about humanity, how many of us have ancestors who were either involved in torturing other people or were tortured by other people, right? Or some kind of trauma. Like I come from the Rajput community, right? From Rajasthan originally. And my ancestors were on the frontier of India, the northwest frontier, which is where most of the invaders came. Like India has been invaded, I believe, 200 times in its history. And mostly from the northwest. And mostly it was my ancestors at the front lines of trying to resist, in some cases, overwhelming odds, overwhelmingly and more powerful armies, and many of them going to their certain death and leaving behind their wives and children who often committed mass suicide, right? The Johar, right? Rather than be enslaved or captured by the invaders, they would rather die. So now think about all that trauma is sitting in my lineage. Right?
And it's getting transferred from one generation to another unconsciously.
It's in there. It's in my psyche, right? Now, why are Rajputs such heavy drinkers? Right? So many of them die of liver disease. I've got uncles who are alcoholics, complete, because there's that deep-seated pain that was acknowledged, right? And the only way, easy way to try to numb it is alcohol. And so we're more susceptible to that, right? The more trauma there is in the background, the more there will be these escape mechanisms that people will use. So I think the greatest thing we can do is step back and say, yes, let me examine. And by the way, some of these memories, like there were things that happened to me in my life that I don't have any memory of, even though I was like 25 years old when that happened with my father. Because there's a mechanism called dissociative amnesia, where something really traumatic happens. Your mind, in order to protect you, will basically erase that memory. Okay, so that you don't have to relive it. But it's still buried inside you. There's a classic book on trauma called The Body Keeps the Score. So the body has all of that within it. And if I look at my chronic pain at times and other things that happen to me, a lot of it is because of those kinds of things, right? So that memory, I only learned about that incident 4 years ago, actually, in 2019, of something that happened 35 years ago.
Wow, in your family?
Between me and my father, I have these multiple traumas between me and my father. So that's my first. So there's personal trauma, what I experienced directly as a child, and then between me and my father. There is family trauma, things that happen in your family system,
Hmm.
maybe before you were born. In my
Hmm.
case, it did happen, something that happened 75 years ago before I was born. But I lived in the shadow of that trauma.
And it
And the
continues
energy.
to move from one generation to another. So isn't it, Raj,
Oh, yeah.
what I'm listening right now is that we live in a choiceless world and we believe we have got choices. But what about the traumas which are getting transferred from one generation to another? As you just mentioned, something happened 75 years back,
Yes.
and you still experience the imprint of that in your day-to-day conversations.
Until you come to this awareness, and that's why the book is called Awaken, right? Until you
Hmm.
come to that awareness, so we are not choiceless. We have now the ability to stop this cycle, right? We are all victims. If I look in my family, every son was the victim of his father. Okay, it just cascades through the generations
Oof.
because there was so much of a father wound. We come from a very patriarchal system, especially the Rajputs. It's a very feudal culture, right? It's all fathers and sons. The women are
Hmm.
almost incidental to the whole story.
Yeah.
And it's a deeply, deeply unhealthy relationship. My father and I had a very difficult relationship, and he had an even worse relationship with his father. And
Hmm.
you can trace it. And someday I recognize, oh my God, my relationship with my son is starting to mirror that. But that was the moment of awareness. And I said, I'm going to break the cycle of victimhood through awareness, through recognition, through working on yourself, right? Trying to heal these things. That's how you break that cycle. So we do have choice, right? My father had a choice, but he didn't have the awareness.
Hmm.
He didn't have the tools. He could not
Got it.
talk to anybody. He was sworn to secrecy about something that happened 75 years ago, which was an honor killing, basically, in our family, where one of my aunts got pregnant, was raped essentially by a priest.
Hmm.
And that was deemed to be something that would destroy the family's honor. And so she had to be erased. And she was literally killed, and her baby was killed and disappeared. I was like, nobody, suddenly what happened to them? And that trauma was something my father witnessed and had to live with for the rest of his life
And when you said she was killed, by whom?
within the family, her own brother. And by the way, that uncle went mad soon after. He completely went mad. He had to be locked up in a room for the rest of his life, raving and ranting day and night, because he was forced in a way by this patriarchal, honor-based feudal culture that he was forced to do this because he was the oldest son. They couldn't even talk about it. They were not sworn to secrecy. You could never
Yeah.
mention her. And there was no concept of therapy or anything. Nothing was available, right? So all you could do was swallow it and try to numb it and go.
And be with that pain.
That's what my father did for 65, 68 years, right? Every day he had to drink. That's the only time you saw him smile and lighten up. And then he had to take sleeping pills to fall asleep because there was no escape, right? He was a very intelligent man, but that's almost becomes a curse when your mind is always running and fast. You could never find peace of mind. And I was like that for a long time until I started developing these awarenesses and say, yeah, there is a path forward from this, right? There is life on the other side of trauma once you start to work on all of these things. And for me, it's been a combination of some of the psychedelic plant journeys, reading books and meeting healers along the way, and also actually working to heal what's happened in my family system in India. So last year, before the book came out, the epilogue of the book really is me going back to India and with this awareness of what happened in our family 75 years ago, which was buried and nobody was supposed to talk about it. All they said was there's a curse. We don't know why there's a curse, but there's a curse on our family, and this is what people say. And I discovered the roots of that so-called curse were that these two souls were killed in this way. And so we did a healing ceremony, a healing circle with the entire extended family to talk about what had happened in our family 75 years ago. None of us are culpable in that. None of us were there. We have an aunt or two still living who could remember, but still it happened in our family system, and we need to acknowledge the truth and in a way atone for it, beg forgiveness for it, honor the memory of those who were lost, not just erase them completely from history as though they never existed. And so we did that. We had that circle. Everybody got to speak and talk about what thoughts and emotions came up for them, especially the next generation of our family. The goal of all of this was ultimately to connect back or to our family's higher purpose, or dharma. Right? What is the dharma of Rajputs? My uncles and cousins are very proud of being Rajputs and being called Thakur and Kamar and whatever, and having all this land and all this unearned prestige. And they've used it essentially to abuse people, to take advantage of their position of power. And, I've seen so much abuse in that village. And I said, no, the dharma of a warrior is to protect and defend the people.
Yeah.
To sacrifice themselves if need be, right? And we have gotten to the other extreme of that, right? The opposite of that. We're not the defenders and protectors, we're the abusers of the people, right? So we have to commit back to what is our real dharma here. Why do we have this privilege and this power? There's a responsibility that comes with that. So I think it was a very healing moment.
Yeah.
And for me to write about these kinds of things in the book, I could only justify it if I was able to take it all the way to healing.
Yeah.
Otherwise, it just becomes like gossip, becomes like salacious. Oh my God, shocking detail.
While I was reading this book, and especially what you're just talking about right now, when I was going through those pages, when I was going through those sentences, I literally had goosebumps. I had to read it and reread it. That is what I'm reading happened in reality. And then I was wondering if that's one reality of one family, it could be a reality of so many families as well. And then there's a sentence that you mentioned, that what we fear confronting the most is what needs the deepest healing. Yes. Raj, if I look at the perspective that you're just bringing in and what you have just mentioned in that book, I think the whole humanity needs to confront the fear that we have been dealing with and heal ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. I start the book by saying that which is deeply personal is also completely universal. I think it's from Carl Rogers.
Yeah.
And so there's some version of this, maybe not as extreme, in many families, especially coming from certain cultures, but across the world really. And so we have to acknowledge that. And I do agree that there's so much of the past that has not healed because we have not done this kind of work, right? And that's an interesting thing. Can you heal the past? Even though it's gone, right? There's nothing you can do about it. And yet you can heal it because the wound is still there. So in the present moment, we have the ability to heal the past. Think about what happened in South Africa after the end of apartheid, right? One school of thought is, okay, close that chapter and now just move on, right? Start afresh, with a clean slate. But there's a lot of pain that has not been acknowledged, right? And so they set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, right? And the truth has to precede reconciliation. Without the truth, there can be no peace.
And what is truth? How do you define truth, Raj?
Well, the truth is what happened in those 200 years of apartheid, right?
So accepting that.
Well, first of all, acknowledging it. And that means also the people on both sides, but especially the white people in South Africa, to say, yes, we were part of this system. Yes, maybe I did not directly abuse somebody, but I was the beneficiary of that system that did. I was the beneficiary of that system that was rooted in so much abuse in India, right? All of us who come from upper castes in India are the beneficiaries of so much suffering that happens, right, in those systems by the lower caste people who are born into that, right? And so you have to bring the truth in, which is why I had, in order to do that ceremony in India, the first thing was what happened. To the extent that we can reconstruct it, what was the truth of what happened? Why? And then you can move on, right? So without the truth, and that's why truth is such a fundamental thing, right? Even Gandhi talked about his experiments with truth and so forth. Without truth, there can be no peace. So you have to first acknowledge, and this is something, by the way, the US has not done a good job at. The US has never fully acknowledged the wounds of slavery.
Yeah.
Everybody else in the world gave up slavery a long time before the US did. It took a war, the bloodiest war in the history of this country. And even after that war, with the narrowest of margins, was won by the anti-slavery side. For another 100 years, the remnants of that system continued by other means. And then finally, when the civil rights happened in 1965, 100 years after the Civil War, even after that, those wounds are why? Because there are many people even today who look back with nostalgia right, towards the Confederacy where the slavery existed in the US, right? And that's why this whole movement is going on right now. So again, not acknowledging the past means that those wounds will always be fresh and they will always be with you. So in the present moment, we can do the right necessary work to heal the past so that we can heal in the present and create the conditions for continued healing into the future.
Raj, because this is quite disturbing what I'm listening right now. If a child is rejected, or if a child feels as if she's being rejected, that could cause a trauma. A death of one of the parents could lead to trauma. And if one is not even aware, it can lead to traumas, and that can get transferred from one generation to another. I'm just concerned now because you mentioned that it's personal traumas, it's family traumas and ancestral traumas, and then you spoke about the
And
collective
collective.
trauma, right?
Both is collective, which is like climate change, right? Or
Yeah.
the pandemic. These were collective traumas for the whole world.
And right now, the world is talking about artificial intelligence. We are talking about technology. We are talking about reaching Mars. We are talking about reaching Moon. But I think without the basics in place, why are we even talking about that? I mean, don't you think that we need to get this shit cleaned first? Pardon me for my language. Because if with that wounded self is that traumatic past, if I'm marching ahead, I would only be giving what I have, because I cannot serve the other person from an empty cup. So I'm a little concerned, disturbed, clueless here.
I agree with you. I think the great work of our time is to heal and to heal the past, right? And recognize what needs healing across the world. Almost every human can trace back. They were either enslaved or they were the enslavers in some way, or they were the abusers or the victims. And both are traumatic. But it's also traumatic to be the inflictor of suffering on somebody else, because that also damages the human psyche when you do that to some other human being. And so can we live without causing suffering? Can we live in a state of innocence? Can we get back to a place of innocence, which we are born with? That's our birthright, right? And so I think, yes, the great work of our time is to heal ourselves, because I tell leaders, if you are inspired by the healing organization and the 25 stories of companies there, you cannot be that unless you work on your own healing, right? You cannot be a healing leader if you don't heal yourself. You cannot run a healing organization. Likewise, we can't have a society that heals when we are led. I mean, if you look at people like Trump and you look at people like Putin and so forth, and any dictator the world has ever seen, there is deep childhood trauma. There's a wounded inner child in each of those despotic leaders, right? And then the loving leaders are the ones that have done the work to heal their wounds, heal their inner child. Right? They're the ones who are able to make a difference. So yes, I think what we're also doing in the world is a lot of escape mechanisms by other names, right? So all these billionaires are obsessed with going into space and going into Mars because we've made too much of a mess over here, right?
Yeah,
that's not the answer. The answer is to stay here and restore and replenish what we have done.
Since we are talking about leaders, before we even talk about how does this work show up in the organizations, right? I've got one more question, Raj. How can one go back and identify that that's my trauma and that's where it's coming from? Because unless you acknowledge that, as you mentioned, we'll not be able to heal that.
I think we can try to do that ourselves. Like my partner Neha has people do a life map and all of the significant things in their life and what, why those moments were significant. And some are positive, some are negative. But I do think ultimately that it requires a skilled therapist to be able to help you excavate your own life and understand events in retrospect that in fact you have brushed away or you've tried to erase or forget or whatever, but things that stick in our memory are there for a reason. It's not everything sticks in our memory. Most things don't. 99% of things don't, right? And so there's about 2,000 therapists now who've been trained by Gabor Mate I don't know if you've mentioned him yet, but he's one of the great thinkers and experts now
Indeed.
in this field of trauma-informed therapy. And these people have all been trained in this modality of compassionate inquiry, which is to say that you were talking to somebody, but you're trying to get at the roots of where this may have started.
Yeah.
And where there might have been trauma. Like my son has special needs, right? He's got bipolar disorder and he has pervasive developmental disorder. But when I talked to Gabor Mate about him, he said, is he a very sensitive child? I said, yes, he's very sensitive. And he said, I believe there was probably some trauma in his early life, which brought on some of these things. Traditional medicine will tell you these are all things that were programmed already into his brain, and there's a chemical thing, and right? As opposed to, did your life experience play a role in that?
Yeah.
Was this some kind of an adaptation mechanism, right? So obsessive compulsive disorder, for example, is a mechanism to try to help people feel control over their life. So again, not always, but very often you can find some incident, that imprinted this trauma on them. And once you do that, then you can't erase what happened. But the lingering psychological effects of what happened, those can be healed.
Yeah.
Those can be worked. So I think I would recommend to people for whom this touches a chord of some kind, that go to compassionate inquiry. Just search for that. There's a website and there's people you can talk to. And there are others as well that can help with this, but it really does help, I think, to talk to an expert on this.
And help me understand, Raj, now, since we are talking about it's important to trace back where it's coming from and the kind of impact that it would have in your life. And I'm just taking one step forward because I personally believe that if one is operating from some kind of trauma, and we all have some or the other traumas in our life, it actually impacts our relationship with ourselves. It impacts our relationship with others. It impacts our relationship with the world, with life, because we look at a situation, we look at ourselves, others, life, and the world through that lens of trauma, which is not healed. How does this show up in an organization? If you can just share a couple of examples, having worked with so many C-suite executives, so that people can see that, it does not only have an impact in your personal life.
Yeah.
It impacts everyone who's working with you. So as a leader, who's an unhealed leader, what kind of impact can he have onto others?
Right. So I've seen both sides of that, right? So I've seen leaders who had significant trauma in their lives and who then recognized that and worked on themselves and then were determined to create organizations where that was not the case. Right. So Nandakishore Chaudhary in India with Jaipur Rugs.
Yeah.
He had trauma in his life. He was considered too innocent, too simple. Everybody said you can never succeed in business. World is going to eat you alive. And so he didn't get any respect. He was dismissed, etc.
Yeah.
And ultimately he started Jaipur Rugs as a way. He said, I want to serve the innocents. There are people, these women who make these carpets who've never asked for anything. All they've done is serve other people. They're the innocents. I want to serve them. He wanted to honor and elevate the innocents. We write about Danny Meyer in the healing organization, Union Square Hospitality Group. And he grew up with a very dysfunctional family. There's a lot of arguing and a lot of fighting and a lot of competition between siblings and so forth. And so he created a company which created the kind of family atmosphere that he wished that he had. Right? So he talks about sibling revelry, not rivalry. Revelry is like celebrating together, etc. So again, you can transmute your own pain into something beautiful on the other side. But those are the healed leaders. That doesn't last long, So John Mackey of Whole Foods, he had trauma with his mother, and that he has worked on himself. He said, every time I get stuck, the company gets stuck. And because of my wounds or whatever, I'm not able to lift my consciousness. The company is stuck here. But then if you go and work on my own healing, right, and he's done a lot of that over the years, then the company is able to elevate to the next level. So it very much is true that the macrocosm is a reflection of the microcosm as a leader.
Yeah.
What's inside will get projected 1,000-fold or 10,000-fold out there. And so you see a Ratan Tata, you see a JRD Tata, or you see some of the other conscious leaders.
Azim Premjis of the world, Guru Raj
Yeah,
Deshpandes of the world, Anand Mahindras of the world.
Yeah, their consciousness, you can see it's a loving consciousness. It's a blend of strength and love, right?
Yeah.
Same organization led by somebody else can become a cutthroat place.
Yeah.
Right? Because you saw what happened at Tata's under mystery for those few years, and all the that he brought in, it was unrecognizable from the culture of the Tatas. So I think all of this matters a great deal. The more significant a leadership role you have, the greater your duty or responsibility to work on healing, because the multiplier effect is dramatic. I do want to broaden before we end here. Healing is one of the big elements in this book, right? But there's also, I talk about these 7 steps.
Yeah.
And actually,
I want to come there as well. Before that, I've got one question. You have spoken about in this book called Awaken, called A Journey to Purpose, Wholeness, Healing, and Impact. What's the connection between purpose, wholeness, healing, and impact?
Well, I think those are all pieces of the puzzle for me. They unfolded in a particular sequence for me. For me, I discovered my purpose first around 2005 when I was writing Forms of Endearment. Before that, I had been very unhappy, unfulfilled, and I would say unimpactful business professor, because I was very disillusioned with what I was seeing in the world of business, especially in marketing. And I was following what Andrew Harvey called my heartbreak. I was noticing all the negative consequences of the way we were doing business. Other people were oblivious, most other people. So I was writing about the ethical problems, the way we impacted women, the way we impacted children, how much money we were wasting, or we were causing diabetes and overweight and obesity and all kinds of conditions, because we're just trying to create and feed addictions out there. We're not really doing things that are in the best interest of our customers. I was looking at it from a market. And then I discovered this other way of being in my book, Forms of Endearment, which was companies that are loved by everybody. Customers love them, employees love them, etc. And they don't spend a lot of money on marketing. And I discovered the bliss on the other side, right? I had literally tears of joy in my eyes as I was trying to write that book and some of those stories. And that connected with me in a deep, for the first time, my heart was touched by my work. For that, everything stopped here, right? It's the head and the wallet.
Beautiful.
That matters. And then I knew my purpose had found me. That there's this story of business that's very different than the traditional story, that businesses with deep heart and compassion and humanity can not only survive, but actually win in the world. That was the great message of Forms of Endearment, right? Companies rooted in love and care are stronger, more resilient and longer lasting. That endearing companies are enduring companies. That was my that was my nature, my swabhav. Right, as we say in India, right? But I was disowning that, because to be in the world of business in the US, you kind of had to leave that at home, right? You had to be just a warrior, a market warrior, right? And suddenly I was giving myself permission to be who I was and bringing that into the world of business. Years later, in 2018, when I turned 60, I worked with a coach, and she had this insight, which was very life-changing for me. She said, you realize that you spent 45 years trying to impress your father with what he deemed valuable, right? It's power, it's money, it's position, it's success, it's whatever. Now you spend the last 15 years honoring your mother with your work. That everything starting with Forms of Endearment and then Conscious Capitalism, Shakti Leadership, Everybody Matters, Healing Organization, all of this is bringing my mother's energy into business and leadership, which is a very compassionate, loving, accepting energy. And in a way, that was my role to play. I'm very much like my mother. Right?
I think that's what you meant, uniting polarities.
Well, yes. So that was, so I was trying to impress my father, but that's not who I was at my core, right? But I was trying to, because he told me everything that came naturally to me, he said, is a weakness. He said, you're too idealistic, you should be pragmatic. You're too peace-loving, you need to be tough and tough, right? You're too trusting, you should not trust anybody. You're too intellectual, you need to be street smart. So I thought I was just defective. I was trying to be, to please him. But then I had incidents with him, a trauma incident, etc. So I started defining myself in opposition to him. I want to be the kind of father exactly the opposite of who you are. I rejected everything about it. Right? And then I was on this path. But I think to me, the bottom line ultimately of this journey is that we need to blend the best of both. My father had great personal power, charisma, brilliance, determination, all those things. But he did not come from love. If I did something, I said, I want to marry somebody, he didn't approve, he cut me off. He said, you're dead to me, I don't care about you. You don't exist. My mother had pure unconditional love. There's nothing I could have done in this lifetime that would have reduced her love and acceptance of me.
Wow.
But she did not have any personal power. She was completely disempowered, right? And hence she did not have the impact that that love could have had. See, love needs to be empowered, right? And so to me, the holy grail becomes, how can you have great personal power with great unconditional love? Bring those two together. That's possible.
That's uniting polarities.
And those are considered polarities. Masculine, feminine is a classic polarity. Right?
Beautiful.
The answer is not one or the other. The answer is both.
Yeah.
And that's profit and purpose, right? Who am I?
Yeah.
What's my core? What's not what my father tried to make me become, or what my system, my society, my caste, my religion, my culture, whatever. Who am I at my core? What was I born with? What was my original,
as you mentioned, the Swabha, what's my absolute nature?
Yeah, what's my essential nature? And then you have to love yourself. Because I, at some point, realized who I was, and I thought, oh my God, I'm just a bunch of weaknesses and defects. I hated myself for decades, largely because of my father's messaging to me. I looked up to him as a larger-than-life figure in my life, and he gave me the message. I was not okay. And so that was a big leap. Most, I would say, I've seen some data, 80 to 90% of people hate themselves, do not love themselves.
Yeah.
Right? The quote is that men are at war with each other because they are at war with themselves.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely, yes.
Creates that. And so how do we get to that place, not only of acceptance, but of embrace and
loving yourself,
and gratitude for who I didn't make myself. I am a gift to myself. Right? None of us created whatever endowment we come with on all the capacities. That's a gift we were given. So we have to be grateful for that and embrace it, right? So know yourself, love yourself, and then be yourself, right? And then I talk about choose your life. For many years, decades even, I was kind of a victim of my own life. I said, why was I born to this father? Why can't my father be like my friend's father? Why was I born into this abusive culture, right? Why could not I have been part of this, etc., etc.? So I kind of looked at what had happened and saw myself as a victim of my own life. And I had this realization at a silent retreat 5 years ago that, where we were given food at lunchtime and they didn't even ask us, what do you want? They just put a whole bunch of food in your tray because you're not supposed to communicate. And I said, life is like that. Life is not a buffet. You don't get to say, I'll take this father and that mother and this culture and that religion. And you're just given it, right? So life's not a buffet. There's no menu that you can order. You're given a tray full of stuff. And some of it looks bitter and unappetizing. But you need all of it. This is your curriculum for this life. So choose it. I say, now I choose that father. I choose that guy. I choose my special needs son. I choose my difficult marriage. That happened to me because it enabled me to become who I was meant to be.
Yeah.
If I did not experience that abusive masculine culture when I was a child,
you would not be here where you are.
I would not have written Shakti Leadership about the feminine.
Yeah.
Right? So everything starts to connect in that way. So choose your life, then express yourself into the world. So not just be comfortably resting in yourself, but then project that you are the missing piece of the puzzle out there. Right? You're carrying that piece that's going to help complete that puzzle. And that requires taking some risks, choosing growth over safety. And therefore you start dying if you stop growing. So you have to take those risks and you have to be on those heroes' journeys. You are being called to evolve to the next level, right? And you might be going through that right now to pick up on these things. There's something calling you to get to the next level of this thing, right? To become the caterpillar, becoming a butterfly is not a painless process. It's a very traumatic process.
It is a painful process.
Yeah, but it results in something of great beauty and impact, right? On the other side of it. So it's hero's journey. So that's express yourself. And then become whole is the next step, number 6, which is integrate that masculine, feminine that we talked about. But also I talk about the elder and the child. We have these 4 energies, right? The elder, the child, father, mother energy, all of them. So Nilima and I talk about become the wise fool of tough love. You have the wisdom of the elder, you've got the playfulness of the child, you've got the strength, of the strong father, and you've got the unconditional love of the father. And again, these are sort of prototypical energies. I'm not saying every father is strong and every mother is
Yeah,
loving.
yeah.
And then, and the last is heal yourself.
Heal yourself.
So that's healing your body, healing your story. You can tell your story of your life to somebody you meet in the plane. You can tell your story as a hero, right? Oh, look at what I did. Or you can tell the story as a victim. Look at all these terms, make that person cry, okay? Because those are both true stories. Or you can tell your story as a learner, right? Here's what happened, here's what I learned, here's how I grew. That's the most empowering story. And then, of course, heal our wounds and traumas. And that's what we've been talking about for quite a while. That's the biggest piece, the hardest piece in many ways, but also the one that rewards. The Japanese have a beautiful metaphor called kintsugi, the art of precious scars. So when a piece of pottery breaks, they don't throw it away. They put it back together using a mixture of gold, dust, and glue.
Yeah.
And so now you have a work of art which is stronger than if it never broke in the first place, because when a piece of pottery breaks, it breaks along the lines where it's the weakest. And now we have strengthened those lines where it was the weakest. So now this piece of pottery is probably unbreakable.
Yeah.
Much more so. So that is us. We all have these scars.
Yeah.
We all have these wounds. But if we heal them, we can have these precious scars. And now we become, so to me now, coming especially from that warrior class, it's about, can I be a peaceful warrior? And can I be the wounded healer? You can be both.
Absolutely. I just love this analogy that you're talking about. I can go on and on and on in this conversation. And I think we would definitely need the part 2 of this conversation, because would love to definitely get deeper into what happens when you're not healed. How do you carry yourself? The 7 steps that you've spoken about. Would love to have you again on this podcast and double click on all those 7 points, because as simple as when you're talking about knowing yourself, is that easy? Loving yourself. I'm not being able to accept myself. How would I embrace humanity, right? How can I be myself? How can I become whole? Now, these are the topics that we would need another couple of podcasts.
And that's going to be the next book. It's called Healing Leaders, seven Steps to Recovery of Self.
Beautiful.
The true self, right, that we are.
Thank you so much, Raj. An absolute pleasure it was, as expected.
Thank you, Gaurav. Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to seeing you next time.
Looking forward. Thank you.